So this topic is all about transport systems in plants, and this is part of a sort of wider topic on transport systems in general. So we're going to look at the transport systems in plants in this lesson, and then in the following lesson we'll start looking at some of the ones that are in animals. So first of all, what is a transport system? Well, if we think about that in terms of a transport system that you might use, it gets you from A to B, like a bus or a train. So transport systems in living things are about getting things from one point to another point. And they're needed because multicellular organisms like plants and animals, every single cell inside them requires things like oxygen, glucose, and water. But the problem is they can't just diffuse into every single cell from the outside because we're made up of so many cells. It's different for things like bacteria. They're one cell in size. So for them, they can just absorb glucose and oxygen and water by diffusion, and they're quite happy. But for you, for example, the cells inside your liver could not possibly absorb oxygen from the outside environment because it would have to pass through thousands and thousands of cells just to reach there. So living things, multicellular organisms require transport systems to get substances from one place to another. So let's have a look at the transport systems in plants. We're going to try and cover the basic plant structure. We're going to look at a few specific transport systems called xylem and phloem. We're going to look at the structure of the leaf, and we're going to look at a process called transpiration. Okay. So thing we need to keep in mind when we're talking about plants is this key process called photosynthesis. So you should recognize this. This is a slightly different version, but you should recognize it. There's only one thing different. So carbon dioxide and water need to be taken in by the plant, and we then need some of the sun's energy captured by chlorophyll to produce sugars, glucose, and starch, and oxygen as well as a byproduct. So it's important that we remember this. We need to think though, where exactly is photosynthesis taking place in a plant? Because it doesn't happen in every single cell of a plant. It actually happens in the leaves. Okay, these are structures that are specially adapted to be able to carry out photosynthesis, and that's where our sugars and things are produced. The problem is, we need carbon dioxide and water in these leaves for this process to happen. Now, the carbon dioxide's a wee bit easier. That can just diffuse into the leaves, but we're going to look at where in the leaves that's happening. But the water's a little bit more tricky because the water is in the soil, which is down here. So how do we get the water from the soil up the plant and into the leaves for photosynthesis to take place? And then similarly, once we've actually done the photosynthesis, well, the oxygen, again, is a wee bit like carbon dioxide. It's easier. It can just diffuse back out of the leaves, and we'll look at where. But the sugars that have been produced, the glucose, well, these roots are going to need some of that for respiration to take place so that they've got energy to do their job and to stay alive. So how do we get the sugars back down from the leaves to the roots? So for that, to get the water up and the sugars down, this is where we need our transport systems. So the first one we're going to look at is the xylem. So xylem are specialized tubes that effectively run all the way up the length of the plant, from the roots all the way up to the leaves. They're long, hollow tubes. One way to think of them is they're a little bit like straws, to be honest. So imagine that water travels up these xylem tubes, a little bit like water would travel up a straw if you were to suck on the straw. Now, they need to be strengthened because remember, some plants are very flexible, very bendy in the wind, and some plants are not like that. So for example, trees are a lot stronger, a lot more rigid. So these tubes need to be kept open, they need to be held open at all times. And that happens because they are strengthened by rings of something called lignin. Okay, so lignin is a special chemical substance that keeps these tubes open. And you can see that there. It looks a little bit like a spring. So it's just keeping it open. We have something similar in our airways, in our trachea. It's held open by rings of cartilage. So the animal version of lignin is cartilage. It's doing the same thing. It's keeping that tube open so that it doesn't collapse and stop the flow of anything passing through it. The other job that xylem has, in addition to taking water all the way up a plant, is they support the plant. So when water actually is passing up through this xylem vessel, it puts a lot of pressure on it. And that pressure keeps it quite solid, quite a strong structure. And that helps support the plant and keep it upright. And you'll notice that if you actually forget to water a plant, it starts to dry out. The plant can wilt and it can fall over. And it's because there's no water passing up this xylem, putting pressure on it and keeping it strong and upright, and it'll just flop over. So when xylem are in use, when plants are watered and they've got water running through them, it'll help support the plant and keep it upright. One other unusual thing about xylem vessels is that they are actually dead. So these are effectively just hollowed out cells. So I want you to imagine that xylem it's just a stack of cells end to end that have been hollowed out. So there's no cytoplasm, there's no vacuole, nucleus, chloroplast, anything like that. These are effectively hollowed out cell walls that are in a cylinder shape, which is what forms the tube. And then that lignin stuff that we've mentioned, that keeps that tube open. So quite unusual. So these xylem are a transport vessel specifically for water and minerals that are dissolved in the water, like sort of nitrogen, potassium, that sort of stuff that comes from the soil. So that's their job, support the plant and get water from the roots down at the bottom up to where it's needed, which is the leaves further up at the top. So how does the water actually get in to these xylem then? So we need to consider that. So we should remember from the previous unit that water moves by a process called osmosis. So it moves from high water concentrations to low water concentrations along a concentration gradient. So what happens is when it rains, when there's moisture in the soil, we're going to have a really high water concentration here, okay? So here's our high water concentration. And what will happen is it will start to diffuse by osmosis into these root hair cells. So plant roots are very hairy, and these hairs just give them a larger surface area for water to actually be absorbed by. So the high water concentration, we've got our water moving into this root hair cell, and what we have is there's constantly a higher water concentration at each of these stages than the one further on. So water is continually moving like this until it reaches these xylem vessels. And once it's in the xylem vessels, it then starts to move up the plant, okay? So we need to be really, really clear that water enters a plant by osmosis. Once it's in the xylem, that water is then pulled up towards the leaves where it's needed for photosynthesis. And what's pulling it is on the actual leaves themselves, there are tiny little pores, tiny little holes. And these holes are called stoma or stomata. And when these are open, water evaporates out of the leaves through these pores and back into the air. And that process of water leaving a plant leaf is called transpiration. Now, if we quickly skip ahead to this picture, we can get a slightly better idea of what is happening here. So this is us down in the roots here, and we can see that water is entering the root hair cell here by osmosis, and it's continuing to move by osmosis until it reaches the xylem, which is this tube here, and it then travels up that tube, up the plant, into the leaves. And once it's in the leaves, water leaves the xylem, and it can then be used by all of these cells that are inside the leaf for photosynthesis. Now, we'll talk more about their role in a minute, but some of that water also evaporates out of these tiny pores that I was talking about called stoma. So we can see another picture of them here. Here is our stoma. That's that tiny little pore in the plant leaf. And water is evaporating out of that. And this process of water moving up and evaporating out of the leaf, that is what we call transpiration. Now, the water will only be able to evaporate out of these stoma when they are actually open. And the stoma are controlled by two cells on either side of them, which are called guard cells. Now, the guard cells are specialized because what happens is when lots and lots of water comes up to them, they will become turgid. And when they become turgid, rather than getting fatter in both directions, they get fatter towards one side. And that is what causes this to open up. So when the guard cells are turgid, the stoma are open. But when the guard cells are not turgid, when they're plasmalized, then they kind of shrink back to their normal shape, which will then close the stoma. And you can see that there. So this is one that is closed, and this is one that is open. So it's being controlled by these guard cells. Okay, so at this stage, we need to be quite clear how water is entering the plant. It's entering these root hair cells by osmosis. It is traveling up these xylem vessels, which run all the way from the root into the stem and into the leaves. And then once it's there, the water is used by the plant cells for photosynthesis, but some of it will evaporate out of the stoma. Okay. Now, the rate of transpiration, the rate at which water is making this movement, can be altered, and there's a few things that can affect it. So the first thing is pollution can actually affect the rate of water loss, the rate of transpiration by a plant. What we find is that when there's high levels of pollution in the air in a particular area, some of that pollution is soot, and soot particles can end up sticking on to leaves. And when they stick onto leaves, they can actually block these stoma, these holes in the plant. So increased levels of pollution can actually decrease the rate of transpiration within a plant. Increased levels of humidity. So if we consider what that means, we're thinking, for example, the rainforest, tropical rainforest, that would be an area that has really, really high humidity. There's a lot of moisture in the air. If you have a plant in the bathroom when you have a shower, that would be a really, really humid environment, lots of moisture in the air. And we find that increased levels of humidity actually decrease levels of transpiration. And that's because what happens is some of this moisture that's in the air, when it clings onto the surface of the plant leaf, it can actually, it'll condense, it'll become a liquid again, and it forms a layer of moisture over the stoma. And that reduces transpiration. Less water is lost by evaporation because, again, these pores, these stoma, have been blocked. When light intensity increases, we find that normally the rate of transpiration will go up. And that is because the plant is needing more water for photosynthesis because there's a lot more light available. So that increases the sort of pool of water up through the xylem and into the plant leaves where it's being needed. And consequently, we will get more water being lost, so more transpiration. A higher temperature also leads to an increased rate of transpiration, and that is because if it's warmer, that increases the speed of evaporation. So that is effectively pulling more water up the xylem and out through the stoma because it's evaporating faster. And finally, wind speed. An increase in wind speed can also increase transpiration. And that's because when it's windy, the leaves are flapping about more in the wind. That also increases the rate at which water is kind of being pulled out through these stoma. So it's increasing the rate of transpiration. So you need to know a little bit about these factors and how they can affect the rate of transpiration. It's all measured using a device called a petometer. So a petometer is a piece of lab equipment where we've got a plant that we're investigating is put into this apparatus, as you can see here. So the plant roots effectively are pushed through a little stopper in this complicated test tube arrangement, and they're in this water here. We've got a little reservoir of water we can top up, and this is all connected to a second reservoir here, another beaker of water, where we have got an air bubble in a tube. And the idea is that as the plant is drawing up water, the little air bubble will move along this scale. And we can then use that as a kind of measurement of the rate of transpiration. The faster the air bubble's moving towards the plant, the more water it's losing. So with this device, we can obviously cover up leaves, we can change temperature, humidity, we can change all those different features, and we can see if that affects the rate at which this air bubble moves. So this is called a petometer, and it's used to measure the rate of transpiration. All right, now we've spoken a little bit about our first transport system, the xylem, how it's involved in water movement. We've also then discussed what transpiration is and what can affect it. What we now need to consider is kind of why we're needing this water, so looking at photosynthesis. And as we've said, photosynthesis takes place within the leaf. So what's not pictured here, so I'm just going to draw it in actually. What's not pictured here is something called a vein. So I'll just put that in purple. Okay, the vein is effectively connected to the little stem of the leaf, which joins on to the main stem of the plant. And this vein has xylem vessels and phloem vessels, which we'll talk about later. So that's how we get the water in. So if we consider that that's there and water can enter this leaf. So let's look at each section of the leaf then. Up at the very top of the leaf, we have something called the cuticle, or sometimes called the waxy cuticle. And this is a protective layer that covers the top of the plant, and it just protects it from excessive heat and things, and excess sunlight. So it's there to protect it. Now, the thickness of the cuticle is different in different species of plant. So some plants have a really thick waxy cuticle. These tend to be plants that are exposed to more extreme environments. So things like cacti and things like plants that are found in the tropical rainforest may have a thicker cuticle than plants we would find in our kind of environment. Underneath the cuticle, we have a layer called the upper epidermis. So it's almost like the skin of the leaf. Would be the way to think of it, and that is just made up of standard plant cells. The cuticle is not cells, this is just a waxy layer that is produced by the upper epidermis cells. Underneath that, we have our largest cells. These are called the Palisade mesophyll cells. And the Palisade mesophyll cells are where the vast majority of photosynthesis is taking place. Now in this diagram here, the clue that tells us that these cells do a lot of photosynthesis are these dots. And these dots are the chloroplast. So you'll notice that this top layer, these cells do not have chloroplast, and neither do these ones down at the bottom. But we've got two layers of cells that do, and this is where the majority of the photosynthesis in a plant occurs. So it's the mesophyll cells, the Palisade mesophyll cells. One way to try and remember that is P for Palisade, P for photosynthesis. This is where the majority of photosynthesis takes place. Okay, underneath the Palisade mesophyll cells, we have the spongy mesophyll cells. So again, same idea. Slight difference is just how these cells are arranged. So the Palisade ones are arranged end to maximize the amount of sunlight available so that there's a huge amount of photosynthesis taking place. Okay, and underneath that, we've got the spongy mesophyll cells, which can carry out photosynthesis. But what's quite important about these cells is you'll notice that this is kind of arranged like brickwork, tightly packed, and this one's not. This one actually has air spaces. And these are really important because the air spaces are where the gas exchange takes place. So if we have a think about that, what gas do we need to come into the leaf for photosynthesis to take place? Well, the answer to that is carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide makes its way in through these pores, which we've already mentioned, called stoma, which are controlled by guard cells. So the CO2 is coming in, photosynthesis is taking place, and then oxygen is produced, which is released back out that way. So gas exchange takes place in these air spaces, which are built into the spongy mesophyll cells. Okay, and the last bit is the lower epidermis cells, which again is just like the skin, but it's on the other side this time. So that is the cross-section of a leaf. You need to know where photosynthesis is taking place. That's the Palisade mesophyll cells, and to an extent the Spongy mesophyll cells. Okay, and we've got what these other sections do as well. Okay, most photosynthesis taking place in these regions here. Now, you don't necessarily need all of this detail, but it may be worth just having a quick look at this just to kind of give you an idea of what each of the different sections is for. As I said, the section which is called the vein, I've added in for you there. So the vein is simply the entry point for the xylem and phloem, and it's very, very close to the mesophyll cells, so that it can bring water in for photosynthesis and take away sugar after photosynthesis. And that leads us on to the last part, the last transport system that's found in plants. And these are also tubes that run up and down the plants, and they are the phloem. And the phloem vessels carry sugar from the leaves back down the stem. One major difference between xylem vessels and phloem vessels is that xylem vessels are dead. They're just hollowed out tubes, but phloem vessels are actually still alive. Okay, again, they're kind of stretched out plant cells. And at the ends of each of the cells, there is a specialized part of the cell wall, which is a sieve plate. So effectively, these cells are connected together and they share their cytoplasm. It just flows. So the idea is that sugar, glucose from the top of the plant, from the leaf, will enter into these phloem vessels, and it can be transported up and down the plant by diffusion based on where it is needed, where the lowest concentration is. It's constantly moving to where there's a low concentration of sugar. To keep these vessels alive, these phloem vessels alive, they have what we call companion cells next to them, which are just normal plant cells that help support these unusual plant cells and keep them alive effectively. So things like the ribosomes, the mitochondria and whatnot, to keep these phloem vessels alive, they're all found in these companion cells next to them. Okay, so here's the key facts. So these are tubes made of living cells that transport sugar from leaves to other parts of the plant, and they are controlled and kept alive by these companion cells. So that is our phloem. If we go back a few, we can just see that again. So this was our big plant, and we can see the phloem are also found in this vein that enters the plant leaf. So the sugars here are entering the phloem, and they can be transported up and down the plant. So another key difference between xylem and phloem is that xylem, it is one direction, the transport. It is always from the root up to the leaf, and then transpiration occurs when the water evaporates out. But phloem is not necessarily one directional. It can go up and down the plant. The sugar moves to where it is needed. So a little task for you. You can pause the video if you want to try this. If we just set up two boxes, xylem and phloem, and there are a whole lot of different features, and you have to try and put them into the correct box. So feel free to pause the video. Once you've given it a go, unpause and we'll look at the answers. Okay, so xylem transport water. We have movement in xylem, but it is only going in one direction. It transports dissolved minerals. It supports the plant. It keeps its shape, keeps it upright. It has no end walls. It is a continuous tube. And it's a hollow tube as well. Our phloem transport things up and down the plant. They are alive, and they're kept alive by these companion cells. The sieve plates are what we find at the end walls, and that separates different cells within the phloem tube, and their job is to carry sugar. Lignin, missed that one. Lignin is what supports the xylem to keep it open and keep it upright. And that is it for plant transport systems. So well done. There's quite a lot in that. You should be able to use this to try and answer your summary notes, and you should be able to do the following things. As a final task, give yourself a little 15-minute challenge, if you like, as a mini essay to explain how a plant is well suited to transporting the substances required for and the products of photosynthesis. Well done. That is the video finished, and you should now be able to complete your summary notes.